tenant then has a duty to pay their rent every month, and if they're not paying their rent or they're not complying with the terms of their lease, then they can be evicted. So moving on to that topic, how to terminate a lease. So this is going to be for people, keep in mind, who have a lease. So there's different ways to get someone evicted if they don't have a lease. As of now, we're going to focus on people who have a lease. So if you have a lease and you're a tenant, how can you terminate your lease? Massachusetts allows tenants to terminate their lease in certain circumstances. One is contacting the landlord, saying, I can't pay anymore, I don't want to live here anymore, will you let me surrender the apartment and let me get out of the terms of my lease? Then the landlord has the right to make a decision, yes or no. If they feel that the tenant is not paying rent and they just want to get them out of there, they don't want to incur any more expenses, they might say, absolutely, you can leave, go, we'll wipe our hands of it. Again, make sure everything's in writing. Make sure that they sign something saying they're going to surrender. You sign something saying that you accept them surrendering the apartment. They move out. You can also, the tenant could also argue that their lease has been terminated by the landlord. How this comes up is if the apartment has a lot of code violations. If the apartment is not sanitary, inspectional services comes in and says there's a whole host of violations. The tenant might say, you know what, I want to move out, I have a lease, but I'm not the one terminating it. The tenant's the one that the landlord's the one that terminated it by having an apartment that's not compliant, so they can argue that. You can also assign a lease and sublet a lease, so long as that's in your lease that you're allowed to do this, or you get permission from your landlord. So the difference between assigning and subletting is slight. A lot of people mistake subletting for assigning. So what assigning is someone has, let's say, a year-long lease. 6 months into their lease, they get a new job, they want to move to Tahiti, and they want someone else to come in and take over the lease for that 6-month period. That's called assigning. The tenant has no plans to move back into the apartment. Someone is going to take over that lease for the rest of the term. Keep in mind that first tenant and the new tenant are both responsible for the conditions of the apartment and rent. If your tenant wants to assign the lease and find someone to rent the apartment, and you say, okay, they can move in here, take the rest of the 6 months, and that new tenant fails to pay rent, you can still go after that first tenant. Now, if they're in Tahiti, I don't know if you'll find them, but they're still responsible. So they need to make sure, if you have this discussion with your tenant, make sure they understand that they're still responsible for the rental payments each month. First tenant's hope is that this new person moving in will take over those payments. Subletting is very similar, except when the tenant decides to move out, they're only moving out for a certain period of time for lease, and then they plan on moving back in. So if they're on business for 2 months and they have someone who's going to come and move in for 2 months to take over the rent, that new person moves out, they move back in again and finish out the lease. That's subletting. So again, make sure that this is a violation of your lease, and if it's not in the lease that you're allowed to, get permission from your tenant or from your landlord before you do this. You can also just move out. The tenant can just one day pick up, pack up, and move out. The problem with this is that you are responsible for the lease term and rent for that lease term. So if you have a 12-month lease, $1,000 a month, that's $12,000 that your tenant is responsible to pay you. So if they just pick up and move, that doesn't mean they're not responsible for rent still. You can still go after them for rent. However, the landlord cannot just sit back and say, there's 6 months left of this lease, I'm not going to do anything for 6 months, I'm just going to go after the tenant for that 6 months, 6-month period. You have to be diligent in searching for a new tenant. You have to, excuse me, you have to advertise for it, try to find someone to move in, see if you can get a new tenant. If you can't, then they would still be responsible, but make sure that you have some sort of proof that you've been diligently searching. The tenant can also try to search for a new tenant as well. If they want to advertise, go out, try to find someone who will then move in and take over. Again, that would be kind of like an assignment of a lease. You can also have a tenant who just stops paying rent. They come to you and say, I want to terminate the lease, I want out. You say, absolutely not, you have 6 months left. That tenant can then go ahead and just stop paying rent. What happens? You then have to start eviction process. You serve them with a notice to quit to try to terminate their tenancy. Once you serve them with a notice to quit, which we'll talk about in a little bit, once that time period lapses, their tenancy is terminated, their lease is no longer valid. If they then move out, their tenancy has been terminated, they've moved out, you've gotten what you wanted. With this day and age though, with the internet and databases, you can have a tenant who gets put on this eviction for non-payment of rent database. So when they go to find a new apartment, they might get flagged as someone who's been evicted for non-payment of rent. So it's a little risky as a tenant to do this because you want to make sure that if you're looking for another apartment, that you can get another apartment and that you're not on all these lists saying that you're a tenant who doesn't pay rent. So those are different ways that a tenant can terminate a lease. Now, how can a landlord terminate a lease? And within this, we're going to encompass the entire eviction process. So there's two ways to terminate a lease. You have to do both steps. You can't bypass the first step and go to the second step. If you do that, you're going to have to start all over again. So as I said before, Massachusetts is very pro-tenant. You cannot, if your tenant stops paying rent or they're doing something to violate the provisions of the lease, you cannot lock them out, you cannot have their things moved out, you cannot shut their water off, you cannot harass them, you cannot do anything but follow these two steps in order to get them out and have some sort of resolution. So the first step is to terminate the tenancy. So the way you do that is, again, this is for if you have a lease, the person's not paying rent. What you're going to do is serve them what's called a 14-day notice to quit. 14-day notice to quit is the notice for non-payment of rent only. So this is also if you do have a tenant at will who doesn't have a lease. Anytime they don't pay rent and you want to evict them for this reason, it's a 14-day notice to quit. And what this notice does is it puts them on notice that within 14 days, because they have not paid their rent, they need to vacate the property and move out. Now, again, until the judge tells them to move out, they don't have to move out. But this is your first step in trying to get them to move out. You serve them with this notice. If they don't cure, which is pay the rent they owe, within 10 days of serving them that 14-day notice to quit, you wait the 4 days to elapse after that 10-day cure period, and then the tenancy is terminated. Keep in mind that if your tenant is habitually not paying rent, and this is the second time you've served them with a 14-day notice to quit within 12 months, that cure period is gone. It's a one-time deal within 12 months. So your tenant's not paying rent, you serve them with a 14-day notice to quit. Within 10 days, they pay you, let's say they owed you $2,000, they pay it. You keep going. A couple months later, they fail to pay their rent again. You serve them with another 14-day notice to quit. They don't get that 10-day period anymore. They've already used it once. So, if it's the first time you're serving them, again, they have a 10-day period to cure and pay their rent. If they do, then it's done. They're paying rent. You keep going on with the tenancy. If they don't cure and they don't pay you the rent that's owed, once that 14 days elapses, they no longer have a lease. The tenancy has been terminated. So if you remember the 4 categories of types of tenants that we talked about in the beginning, your tenant is now a tenant at sufferance. They have no permission to be living in your home. If for some reason, after this tenancy period is terminated, and you do want to move forward with the eviction, and now you're going to go to the second step, I'll discuss in a second, which is filing in court. If they provide you with money, be very, very careful when you accept it, because you need to be clear that they're not paying you rent. They're paying you what's called a use and occupancy fee. So you're accepting a fee because they're staying in your apartment, but it's not rent. If you accept it as rent and you don't make it clear that it's a use and occupancy fee, it may start the new tenancy, and you may now have a tenant at will, someone living in your apartment with no lease, but have permission because now they're paying rent. So if you want to now get them evicted again, you have to start the process all over and terminate the tenancy. So if they pay, again, make sure that it's only for use and occupancy. Most likely, they're not going to pay. So the 14 days has elapsed. You've now terminated the tenancy. You can move forward with the second step. Before we get to the second step, I just want to discuss a few other ways how you can terminate a tenancy.